What would you do if your spouse betrayed you with your best friend? How far would you go to uncover the truth, and what if that truth shattered your world? In this chilling tale of love, deceit, and deadly consequences, a passionate affair in a quiet Seattle suburb leads to murder. Laura Stevens' forbidden romance with her husband's closest friend, Gary, spirals out of control, and one fateful night, everything changes. Was it a crime of passion or something far more sinister? Get ready for a story where secrets unravel, guilt haunts, and lives are destroyed. Could you keep the ultimate secret? On August 2nd, 2012, in a quiet Portland suburb, Laura Stevens made a choice that would lead her down a path of betrayal and murder. What began as an illicit affair with her husband's closest friend spiraled into a deadly game of deception. By the time the truth came to light, it was too late to turn back. Blood had been spilled, and the lives of everyone involved would be changed forever. Laura Stevens, 29 years old, had always considered herself content in her marriage to Jack, who was 32. They had been married for 6 years, and on the surface, everything seemed perfect. Jack had a stable job as a financial analyst. They lived in a cozy home in a Portland suburb, and their lives appeared secure. However, beneath the surface, Laura felt an unsettling restlessness. Jack's frequent work trips left her alone more than she liked, and each time he left, her sense of loneliness deepened. It was during one of these trips in early October 2012 that Laura found herself spending more time with Gary Hamilton, her husband's best friend. At 63, Gary was nearly twice her age, a retired firefighter with a charismatic presence. He had always been a part of their lives, almost like a family member, someone who had known Jack since childhood and had been there for him through thick and thin. Gary would often check on Laura whenever Jack was away, a gesture that had always seemed innocent enough at first. Their relationship began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. What started as casual, friendly conversations over coffee turned into longer visits. Gary had a way of making Laura feel seen, something she realized she had been craving more than she had known. He listened attentively as she talked about her life, her frustrations, and her dreams. His confidence and commanding presence captivated her. Laura found herself looking forward to his visits more and more, feeling a deeper attraction with each passing day. On October 15, 2012, Jack left for a week-long business trip. That evening, Laura invited Gary over for dinner. It was meant to be a friendly meal, a way to pass the time while Jack was away, but as the evening wore on, the mood between them began to shift. They laughed and talked more openly than they had before, and the conversation grew more intimate. By the time Gary was ready to leave, there was an unspoken tension in the air that neither could ignore. As they stood at the door saying their goodbyes, Gary leaned in and kissed Laura. It was a brief kiss, just a moment of weakness, but it ignited a spark neither of them could deny. Laura pulled back, shocked at what had just happened, but before she could say anything, Gary apologized and left quickly, leaving her standing there with her heart racing. That night, Laura couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. She knew it was wrong, but something about it excited her in a way she hadn't felt in years. The next day, Gary called to apologize again, but instead of ending things, they found themselves talking for hours. The connection between them had been set ablaze, and neither was willing to let it go. They exchanged secret messages and met in person whenever they could. The excitement of sneaking around, the thrill of doing something forbidden, drew them closer. They began meeting at Gary's lake cabin, a secluded spot outside of town where no one would find them. Their affair quickly escalated from stolen kisses to passionate encounters, each one more intense than the last. By the time December 2012 arrived, their affair had been going on for nearly 3 months. Laura and Gary had grown more reckless, meeting frequently and using secret phones to avoid detection. The forbidden nature of their relationship made them bolder, willing to take risks they hadn't considered before. But their actions didn't go unnoticed. Cynthia Gray, a 47-year-old neighbor who lived across the street from the Stevens family, had always been observant. She noticed things others might overlook, and she had started to see Gary's car parked outside Laura's house more often than seemed normal. At first, she didn't think much of it. Gary had always been close to Jack, so it wasn't unusual for him to stop by. But as the days passed and Jack was away more frequently, Cynthia couldn't help but wonder if something was going on. On December 22, 2012, during the annual neighborhood Christmas party, Cynthia's curiosity got the better of her. She casually mentioned to Jack that she'd seen Gary around quite a bit, especially when he was out of town. Cynthia made it sound like a joke, not wanting to stir trouble, but she noticed the way Jack's expression changed as she said it. He laughed it off, thanking her for her concern, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, after the party, Jack couldn't stop thinking about what Cynthia had said. He replayed their conversation over and over, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. Laura had been acting differently, distracted, distant, and constantly on her phone. Jack began to suspect something was wrong. Rather than confront Laura right away, Jack decided to watch her closely, looking for signs that might confirm his growing fears. In the days that followed, his suspicion only grew. He noticed Laura had become more secretive, often taking phone calls in another room with hushed conversations. She also started leaving the house at odd hours, claiming she was going shopping or meeting friends, but Jack noticed that she'd be gone longer than usual. The nagging feeling in his gut told him something was off, but he wasn't sure how to approach it. As Christmas approached, the tension between them mounted. Laura, caught up in her affair with Gary, barely noticed the change in Jack. She was too consumed by the excitement of her secret life, blinded by the thrill of what she was doing. Meanwhile, Jack watched her every move, determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant confirming his worst fears. On the cold morning of January 6, 2013, Jack Stevens returned home from what was supposed to be a 2-day business trip. He had finished his work early and decided to surprise Laura, but when he walked into the house, it was quiet, too quiet. Laura wasn't in the living room, where she usually waited for him, and the house had an eerie stillness to it. Jack set his bags down and called out for her, but there was no response. As he moved through the house, Jack's eyes fell on Laura's phone, carelessly left on the kitchen counter. Normally, Laura was very protective of her phone, always keeping it close. But today it sat there, unlocked. A knot tightened in Jack's stomach as he reached for it. He knew he shouldn't invade her privacy, but the doubt that had been building inside him for months pushed him forward. With trembling hands, he opened the messages. What he found made his blood run cold. Dozens of text messages between Laura and Gary, all from the last few weeks. They weren't just casual texts, they were intimate, filled with details about secret meetings, their feelings, and their growing attachment. Each message confirmed Jack's worst fears. Laura wasn't just having an affair, she was having it with his best friend. Jack's heart pounded as he scrolled through the texts, his mind racing with anger, betrayal, and disbelief. The man he had trusted most in the world had been sneaking around with his wife behind his back. Jack didn't confront Laura immediately. He needed proof, something solid that would confirm everything beyond a shadow of a doubt. He decided to gather evidence, ensuring there would be no denying what was happening. That same day, he drove to an electronics store and bought a GPS tracker, along with a small hidden camera. Over the next few days, he carefully installed the tracker on Laura's car and set up the camera in their bedroom, all without her knowing. Every move was deliberate, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. On January 10th, 2013, Jack set his plan in motion. He told Laura he had another business trip, but this time, he wasn't going anywhere. He packed his bags, kissed her goodbye, and left the house as if everything was normal. Instead of heading to the airport, Jack parked his car a few blocks away and waited. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, emotions swirling: rage, heartbreak, disbelief. It didn't take long for the GPS tracker to alert his phone. Laura had left the house and was heading toward Gary's lake cabin. Jack's heart raced as he started his car and followed at a safe distance. Every mile felt like an eternity as he replayed the messages in his mind, his anger growing with each passing minute. When Jack finally arrived at Gary's cabin, he parked far enough away to avoid being seen and approached on foot. The cabin was quiet, surrounded by thick woods that made it feel even more isolated. Jack moved silently, his footsteps muffled by the soft earth. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. Reaching the side of the cabin, he peered through one of the windows and saw them, Laura and Gary, together, sitting close on the couch, laughing and sharing a moment that should have belonged to him. The sight of them confirmed everything. Jack's worst fears were not just suspicions, they were reality. Jack's anger boiled over as he watched them. Without thinking, he burst into the cabin, rage propelling him forward. Laura and Gary jumped up in shock as Jack stormed into the living room. Laura stammered, trying to explain, "It's not what it looks like," but Jack wasn't listening. His world had just collapsed, and the betrayal cut too deep. All he could see was red. Sensing danger, Gary stepped between them, raising his hands in a futile attempt to calm Jack. But Jack was beyond reasoning. The sight of his best friend, the man who had betrayed him, was too much. Jack snapped, fury exploding within him. His eyes fell on the fireplace poker resting against the hearth. Before he even realized what he was doing, he grabbed it. With a roar of anger, Jack swung the poker at Gary. The metal made a sickening thud as it connected with Gary's head. His eyes widened in shock as he crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire. Laura screamed, the reality of what had just happened crashing down on her. She dropped to her knees beside Gary, sobbing uncontrollably. But it was too late. Gary was already gone. Jack stood frozen, the bloodied poker still clutched in his hand as the gravity of what he'd done began to sink in. Gary, his best friend since childhood, was dead. The man who had been like a brother to him now lay lifeless, and it was Jack's hand that had killed him. The affair that once thrilled Laura had turned into a nightmare neither of them could escape. Panic set in as the enormity of their situation hit them. They had to cover this up, make it look like something else, anything but what it really was. Laura, shaking and crying, helped Jack wipe down the cabin, erasing any evidence that might tie them to Gary's death. They ransacked the living room, knocking over furniture, pulling out drawers, and scattering items around to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. All the while, Gary's body lay motionless on the floor, a silent witness to their frantic efforts. As night fell, Jack wrapped Gary's body in a blanket, struggling with the weight of his guilt as much as the physical burden. He carried Gary out to his car, the cold night air biting at his skin. They drove to a remote part of the woods, far from the cabin where no one would stumble upon the scene. Jack dug a shallow grave, the hard earth resisting each thrust of the shovel as Laura stood by, too numb to speak. They buried Gary in silence, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. By the time they returned home, it was early morning. Exhausted, both physically and emotionally, they went through the motions of cleaning up, but the weight of what they'd done hung heavy in the air. The house that had once been a home now felt suffocating, filled with a silence that neither of them could bear. The walls of Laura Stevens' home now held secrets too dark to be spoken. On January 12, 2013, Gary Hamilton was reported missing after he failed to show up for his weekly fishing trip with friends. The police were called, and an investigation was launched, but with no immediate leads, the case quickly grew cold. Laura and Jack tried to return to normal life, but nothing was the same. Laura, now 29, became increasingly withdrawn, haunted by nightmares of that fateful night. Jack, 32, buried himself in his work as a financial analyst, trying to forget what he had done. For weeks, they lived in fear of being discovered. Each day felt like a torturous waiting game as guilt gnawed at them both. Then, on March 6, 2013, 2 months after Gary's disappearance, their worst fear came true. A hiker, out for a walk near the remote area by Gary's lake cabin in the Seattle suburb, stumbled upon a shallow grave. The body was badly decomposed, but dental records confirmed it was Gary Hamilton. The police quickly reopened the investigation, now treating it as a homicide. Detectives interviewed Laura, Jack, and others in the community, trying to piece together what had happened. Suspicion soon fell on Jack after neighbors, including Cynthia Gray, 47, mentioned the tension in his marriage and Gary's close relationship with Laura. Jack tried to keep his composure, but the pressure of the investigation became unbearable. On March 15, 2013, Laura was brought in for questioning. By this time, she was on the brink of a breakdown, the stress and guilt overwhelming her. Under interrogation, she confessed to the affair with Gary but denied any involvement in his death. Her story was inconsistent, her alibi shaky, and her conflicting statements only deepened the police's suspicions. On March 20th, 2013, the police obtained a warrant to search the Stevens home. During the search, they found traces of blood in the living room, despite the couple's efforts to clean up. The evidence was enough to arrest Jack for Gary's murder, and Laura, though not charged initially, was taken in for further questioning. As the case went to trial, the full extent of the affair and the murder was laid bare before the court. Prosecutors painted a picture of a marriage on the rocks, a wife seeking excitement in the arms of her husband's best friend, and a man driven to kill by the ultimate betrayal. Jack's defense team argued that the murder was not premeditated, but a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment. Laura, now deeply shaken and ostracized by her community, was called to testify. On May 12, 2013, she appeared fragile as she took the witness stand, avoiding Jack's gaze. The courtroom fell silent as Laura recounted how the affair had begun. She explained how it had spiraled out of control, how she had become caught up in the thrill of it all, and how she never imagined it would end in violence. Laura admitted she had been careless and reckless, but insisted she never intended for anyone to get hurt. On June 15, 2013, after weeks of testimony, the jury found Jack Stevens guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Laura, though spared a prison sentence, became a pariah in her community. The affair and its deadly outcome had shattered her reputation, leaving her isolated and broken. The quiet suburb of Seattle would never be the same again. Gary Hamilton's murder became a cautionary tale, a dark chapter in the lives of those who had known him. Jack and Laura's marriage, built on lies and betrayal, had ended in tragedy, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. It's chilling how some villains walk away almost unscathed. That brings us to another case we have today. A wife's affair with her mother-in-law ends in deadly murder. One decision can change the lives of everyone around you. Stay tuned for more chilling tales, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out the next video.